course, one of those values is pluralism.
Yes.
Which is become so much a part of your concerns, your beliefs, and what you're trying to achieve.
Yes. Well, I think we're seeing around the world, really, every time pluralism fails, in one way or the other, it ends up in conflict. It's either political conflict, or it's tribal conflict, or it's religious conflict. There are many expressions of conflict. But the fact is that if society does not accept pluralism as a basic fundamental value, then the stresses and strains at some stage or the other will come out to the forefront. They will create risk.
And many of those conflicts that you talk about,
right,
they're based on the lack of pluralism.
Exactly.
Are within the Muslim world.
They're in the Muslim world, but they're also in the non-Muslim world. I mean, you can see it just recently in Kiev. I mean, you can see it's not just the Muslim world. I think the Muslim world is one of the areas, one of the regions where that's happening, but I wouldn't say that it's the only one, far from it. So I don't see this as a Muslim problem. I see it as a global problem. You can't tell, or certainly I wouldn't pretend to know, when the lack of pluralism is going to create an explosive situation. It's one of the things all of us are looking at. When does the lack of pluralism become critical? And most of us in positions of some authority are trying to judge when that is going to happen, what we can do to avoid that situation becoming conflictual. And that's where the whole issue of civil society comes in.
And how do you avoid it?
I think you avoid it, first of all, by trying to preempt it. So you have to identify it, you have to understand the forces that are at play, and you have to try and give yourself as much time as you can to start acting upon the issues. Because it's never one issue, at least as far as I'm aware. It's usually a set of compound issues. So what you're trying to do is reduce the level of risk. You probably can't eliminate it, but you can reduce it to a point where it is no longer explosive.
You said earlier that these issues are not just issues in the Muslim world.
No.
They're in the whole world. And one thing I found, or well, I found many things interesting in your speech in Ottawa, but one of the things on this issue that I found interesting was that you almost had to walk through the basic history, not only of your own time,
right,
but the basic history of the Muslim world and the divisions within it,
right,
to the Parliament of Canada. I mean, when we talk about the clash of ignorance.
right. Well, that's it.
But
that's it.
It's that basic, though.
It's that basic. And when we talked some years ago, I said to you, one of our biggest problems in the Islamic world is that we are absent from Western culture. We don't exist. Now that's changing, but it's changing very, very slowly. Very, very slowly. In my view, much too slowly. And I'm not sure I understand why it's changing so slowly. But much of what I said today to the Parliament is so basic that it could be part of general education around the world, simply so that communities, countries understand what are the dynamic forces in those societies. It's not new. It's been there a long, long time.
I guess that's where we're left after these past 13 years, since 9/11,
right,
since the clash of ignorance became very much in the forefront.
Right.
That leaves you wondering whether really anything has been accomplished in trying to pull down those walls.
I'm not pessimistic.
And you weren't pessimistic last time when we talked either.
No.
And you were convinced that things were changing, but you seem less so now.
No, I'm not pessimistic. I think the issue is recognized. And I think it's recognized in a much wider spectrum than it was when we last talked. But I'm not sure that that change process is occurring in all the areas where it should occur and quickly enough. I'm not sure of that. I mean, what I said today about the differences between Shia Imams and Sunni Imams, that sort of information is so basic. And these sorts of issues really should be part of general knowledge, you know. And I'm not trying to proselytize in any way. I'm looking at this in terms of basic knowledge. That there should be this gulf of ignorance still today is something that worries me.
یا علی مدد، من فرح ناصر هستم و مثل همیشه افتخار دارم که با شما در اینجا در برنامه بازتاب جمعه شب هستم که این فوق العاده است. امیدوارم که شما خوب باشید و من این را میگویم چون میدانم که 2 هفته گذشته در کانادا مشکل بوده است، در حالی که ما با چهره عدم تحمل و نفرت در جامعه مواجه شدیم. پس امشب چند دقیقه وقت میگذاریم تا در مورد وقایع اخیر تأمل کنیم، تا زمان را بفهمیم و تاریخ را درک کنیم که باعث شده مردم چنین اقدامات را انجام دهند و چگونه می توانیم ابزارهایی را بسازیم تا امواج جهل و نفرت را متوقف سازیم و چگونه می توانیم حس غم و اندوه خودمان را متوجه شده و درک کنیم. ما امروز عصر را با بیانیه‌ای که توسط رئیس صاحب کانسل ملی کانادا جناب امیرعلی قاسم-لخا در اوایل این هفته صادر شده شروع می کنیم. پس از آن ما این امتیاز را خواهیم داشت که با ادریان کلارکسون 26مین فرماندار کل کانادا ملحق شویم و ممکن بدانید که ایشان عضو هیئت مدیره مرکز جهانی پلورالیزم نیز می باشند و ما می خواهیم به افکار ایشان در مورد تحولات اخیر و چی نقشی که همه ما می توانیم بازی کنیم گوش بدهیم. سپس مثل همیشه از دکتر تسلیم علانی ورجی می شنویم که او می خواهد با ما صحبت کند که چگونه همه ما می توانیم احساساتمان را پرداز بدهیم و چگونه می توانیم از ایمانمان در این دوران بسیار دشوار قوت بگیریم. و مثل همیشه برنامه را با پارچه های موسیقی به پایان خواهیم رساند. پس بدون هیچ بحث دیگری اجازه بدهید که با رئیس صاحب امیر قاسم-لخا شروع کنیم و ایشان را خوش آمدید بگوییم.
برادران و خواهران عزیزم، چند هفته گذشته برای ما به عنوان کانادایی ها و به عنوان مسلمانان در کانادا با مشکلات همراه بود. خبر کشف اجساد 215 طفل در محل یک مکتب مسکونی سابق در کاملوپس یادآور تاریخ غم‌انگیز جوامع رنج کشیده بومی در کانادا بود. با آنکه برای از دست دادن جان بیگناهان بسیاری ما غمگین می‌شویم و سوگواری می‌کنیم، در عین زمان دستورات دینی خود را به خاطر می‌آوریم که ما را برای مبارزه به خاطر عدالت دعوت می‌کند. همه کانادایی‌ها مسئولیت دارند تا اشتباهات گذشته و حال خود را درک کنند. درد و رنجی که بومیان کشیدند احساس نمایند و با خود یک بار دیگر تعهد کنند که از روند افشای حقیقت و آشتی حمایت نمایند. اوایل این هفته با نوع دیگری از تراژدی که ناشی از جهل بود شوکه شدیم. ما در کنار امت مسلمان و کانادایی ها در سراسر کشور در مراسم عزاداری طلعت افضل، سلمان افضل، مدیحه سلمان و یمنا افضل که در یک حمله تروریستی کشته شدند شرکت نمودیم. ما همچنان برای برادر مسلمان 9 ساله ما فیاض افضل که با واقعیت تلخی از هم پاشیدن خانواده‌اش مواجه می شود دعا می کنیم. ما اسلام هراسی و همه اشکال ایدئولوژی های نجات پرستانه را که باعث نفرت پراگنی می شود محکوم می کنیم و متعهد به ادامه تلاش خود در راستای ترویج کثرت‌گرایی در کانادا هستیم. من می دانم که از طرف همه جماعت ما اظهار می کنم زمانی که می گویم که قلب ما شکسته است و بسیار وقت می برد تا التیام یابد. این حمله فقط به خانواده افضل نبود، بلکه حمله به بنیاد کثرت‌گرایی خانه مشترک ما بود. امروز می خواهم به جماعت بگویم که نماد نور یک اصل مهم در دین ما است و با روشنی نور قوت ایمان ما، ارزش‌های ما، محبت ما و احترام ما برای برادران و خواهران ما است که ما تاریکی‌های جهالت را از بین می‌بریم. پدر و مادرها در روزهای آینده مباحث سختی با فرزندانشان در این زمینه خواهند داشت. برخی دیگر ممکن است احساس استرس و اضطراب زیادی داشته باشند. هر یکی از ما به اشکال مختلف در برابر تراژدی عکس‌العمل نشان می‌دهیم و هیچ کس نباید از صحبت کردن در مورد تأثیرات روانی این حوادث خجالت بکشد. ما به عنوان یک جامعه در رابطه با این مباحث از شما حمایت می‌کنیم و در روزهای آینده انجمنی را برای حمایت شما ایجاد خواهیم کرد. در پایان می‌خواهم به ارواح همه کسانی که در کانادا قربانی نفرت و خشونت شدند دعا کنم. خدایا ارواحشان را شاد و قرین رحمت خود بگردانی. خدایا جماعت، همه امت مسلمان و همه کانادایی ها را در این شرایط دشوار در حفظ و امان خود نگه داری. آمین و خدا حافظ.
با تشکر از شما رئیس صاحب کاسم-لاکا برای دعاها و سخنان متفکرانه شما. امشب ما خوششان هستیم که با خود فردی را داریم که دیدگاه منحصر به فردی در مورد مسائلی که ما در حال پرداختن به آن هستیم که ایشان محترمه ادریان کلارکسون هستند. بانو کلارکسون 26مین فرماندار کل کانادا بود و تصدی او به عنوان فرماندار کل به دلیل علاقه پرشور او به شمال کانادا قابل توجه بود. ایشان مدال شمالی فرماندار کل را ایجاد کرد که سالانه به یک شخص اهدا می شود که به طور برجسته در درک و توسعه شمال کمک کرده است. به طور خاص علاقه خانم ادریان کلارکسون به اولین افراد کانادا قابل توجه بوده است، چرا که گفتگو را به خط اول یک بحث ملی متمرکز ساخت و در حال حاضر پس از استعفا از دفتر فرماندار کل در سال 2005 خانم کلارکسون مؤسسه شهروندی کانادا را به همراه همسرش جان رالستون ساول تأسیس کرد. این مؤسسه به دنبال کمک به کانادایی های جدید است تا بتوانند به طور کامل مشارکت کنند و صداهای مهم خود را به جامعه کثرت‌گرایی ما بیفزایند. و از زمان آغاز به کار در سال 2007 مرکز جهانی پلورالیزم بخشی از فعالیت‌های خانم کلارکسون بوده است. این ابتکار حاصل مشارکت مولانا حاضر امام و دولت کانادا با یک مأموریت جهانی برای خدمت به جهان از طریق پرورش گفتگوی آگاهانه در مورد مزایای تنوع به عنوان یک دیدگاه جهانی است. خانم کلارکسون عضو هیئت مدیره مرکز جهانی پلورالیزم می باشند. ایشان همچنین رئیس کمیته اجرایی آن است و همچنان یک نویسنده با پشتکار و به طور گسترده در مورد سفر مهاجرین نوشته است و نقشی که همه ما می توانیم در تشکیل یک جهان مرفه و مساوات طلب بازی کنیم. لطفاً به خانم ادریان کلارکسون خوش آمدید بگویید.
Madame Clarkson, it is an honor to have you here, especially during such a painful time for so many Canadians. The events of the past 2 weeks have left so many of us with heavy hearts. What has been your reaction and how have you coped?
Well, I have barely coped. I have to say that initially the revelation of the 215 unmarked graves in British Columbia at the Kamloops residential school was something that was, I could not absorb it initially. And then when I had absorbed it, even though I know about residential schools, even though I have read the digested Truth and Reconciliation report and its recommendations, that's 94 recommendations, I think for me it was just the most terrible thing. I felt incredibly sad, and every time I talked about it to friends, I felt tears coming, and even now as I speak to you about it. What is it about it? We knew about the residential schools. We knew, I've talked to many survivors, friends in the Indigenous community. What is it that really has hit me this hard? I guess it's the feeling that this is only the tip of the iceberg. And when you read what more there must be, the thousands and thousands more of the unmarked graves. You think that the most fundamental thing about human beings, their birth and their death, has somehow been desecrated. And it just affected me terribly. And it's affected all the people that I know. Everybody's been talking to each other about it. I have not talked to a single person who said, oh, maybe too much is being made of this. I have not heard that at all. Everybody's saying, what can we do? What does this mean? Then coming on top of that, several days ago, the horrible murder of the Muslim family in London, Ontario, was a deep and shocking thing. And it's interesting because only about 3 weeks ago, my husband and I came back from the country where we had gone out to an area which we know very well. And instead of coming back on 401 major highway, we came back. We said, let's go through Peel. Let's go through Brampton and Bramalea, which those of you who are familiar with the GTA in Toronto know is very South Asian. And I said, I want to see, we were hearing about COVID striking very hard there, etc. And so we drove through all kinds of streets and looked at the houses, which were all nice Canadian houses. Some of them are stone, some of them are brick, lots of them with 3 or 4 cars because they're multiple families live in them, and people all have their cars to go to work, I suppose, and now nobody's going to work much, so the cars are all in the driveways. And people were out walking. It was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And people were out walking in kameez and hijab, and thought, this is wonderful, this is so Canada. And it was really, we stopped at a Dairy Queen and had a blizzard. And I thought, this is just wonderful, this is so Canada. So that's the first thing that came to my mind when I heard about the people in London, Ontario. They were just out for a nice walk on a really warm, beautiful evening, and they were murdered deliberately. So the shock is terrible. And I don't think, one can do anything except mourn for those people and to think they were wonderful people contributing to this country, and to feel for that boy who is now an orphan. I assume that his family will gather around and help, but that is just, to me, the most shocking of events.
Madame Clarkson, I was at the vigil a few nights ago, and what really struck me was the amount of women wearing a hijab who came up to me and said, am I safe? I don't feel safe. I don't know if I can go to the park and feel confident.
Yeah, it's the other thing that really worried me right away is the wearing of clothing that you are familiar with, that you're used to. And in Canada, nobody should question what you wear. I mean, really, nobody. And I will just say that, I came to this country as a refugee and an immigrant and from Hong Kong. And you may know that in Hong Kong, women, from all the glamorous movies made by Wong Chak and so on, that they wear a thing called cheong sam, which is a form-fitting dress that was developed, to the end of the 19th century, I guess, with a high collar and a side opening. And my mother in Canada couldn't, of course, buy those, nor they were never bought. They were always made for you by a tailor in Hong Kong. And so she was a wonderful sewer, and she made her own, and she always wore cheong sam. She did eventually take to wearing slacks and blouses because we had a cottage and she loved to fish, and so she did that. But her day-to-day dress, she made her day-to-day dress because she felt that was something she wanted to keep of herself and her Hong Kong identity. And I thought, it crossed my mind. I thought, what if my mother had been walking down the street like that and people hated her just because she was dressed like that? Why on earth can that be considered to be something that is bad? I just, and what it symbolizes. But what it means to me is that there's such ignorance, that there is such a lack of understanding and a complete unwillingness to believe that others can do what they can do and you do what you do. Canada doesn't have a pretty history in terms of tolerance. But what I think has been hopeful about Canada, and up to this point I have been always saying it, believing it, living it, that we are capable of change.
How did we get here, though? I mean, racism against our Indigenous people, Islamophobia, other forms of hatred, they're not new to Canada, and these events can't be seen in isolation. What historical events specifically have brought us to this?
When I came to this country, there was a law on the books called the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was enacted in 1923. It was deliberately there to keep Chinese out of the country because poor Chinese men were coming to North America, as they had been for over 100 years, to work as laborers, to work in the lowest, filthiest of jobs, because that was better, and sending money home to China because they couldn't get work in China. And so the Canadian government didn't want a lot of yellow people around, and certainly didn't want yellow people reproducing on Canadian ground. So they produced this law, which made people who came here, the men who came here, pay a head tax, it was called. That was very well known in China and in Hong Kong. And Canada had a racist background that matches any other country. When I was a child around rural Ottawa Valley, July the 14th, you did not really want to go anywhere in the Ottawa Valley to all those small towns because there were King Billy parades. This was to mark the anniversary of the victory of the Protestants over the Catholics at the Battle of the Boyne. And there was always a King Billy figure. I remember seeing it once in Smith Falls, Ontario. King Billy dressed with an orange sash on a brindle horse, and Catholics had to stay inside. Until 1960, in Toronto, you could not get a job at the Eaton's department store if you were a Roman Catholic. That is a fact. And so these kind of religious divisions in Canada existed. Because we didn't have many people of other races, I think we took it all out basically on Indigenous people, of whom we didn't know very much, and we certainly tried to keep ignorance going. So I think we have to be really looking at that. I was taught in public school in Ottawa about Indians, and we were encouraged to, actually. We talked about how Indians had been in Canada, and Indians had made canoes, and Indians had made teepees, and we made projects where we took birch bark and little pieces of spruce and tufts of hair from our cat or dog and made little clothings out of them and made projects for class. Nobody ever said to us that 40 kilometers from Ottawa was a reserve at Maniwaki, Kiribati as it's called now. I never saw a living Indigenous person until I was at university, where I went to university with one Indigenous person. I think there's something about that deliberate blotting out, and it fits in with what His Highness has just said about ignorance, that ignorance is what keeps us in this pattern. When we started to know things and we broke everything open, then Canada made great leaps ahead. Great leaps ahead. I'm not denying that. I'm really unhappy about what's happening now, but this is like a second wave of knowledge of things. And that's why all communities, the Ummah, and you as part of the Ummah, the Jamaat, have to be very aware of this, that there are cycles and there are hills and valleys in the expression of prejudice and hatred and exclusion. And that is what we have to watch out for now. We are in a different phase now in Canada, and we have to exert different kinds of will and love and energy in order to get over that.
You know, you talked about history prior to 1960, and you also talked about the head tax. Racism against our First People isn't new, as you mentioned, neither is Islamophobia. But, you know, these events can't even be seen as isolated incidents that we've just seen. But what recent historical events, and I'm even talking in the last 10 years, Madame Clarkson, have brought us to this moment?
Well, it is all rooted in ignorance, as His Highness has just said. And I think in Canada, and His Highness has shown the hope that he has in Canada. I hope that we will not disappoint him. I work my most to make sure that we will not disappoint him in the Global Centre for Pluralism, and also in my own Canadian, the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, which is also about inclusion and about belonging. And that is what His Highness speaks about all the time. And in my way also, we try to do that. And as part of the Global Centre, our interest is in the entire world to make sure that we, having been Canadian and having been people who knew what it was like not to have that kind of who went to fight in foreign wars to make sure that people were included, to help all of that, that we would be in some way in a place that we could help to make things better. So all of it, a reckoning with the past, which the Indigenous graves shows us, a reckoning with who we are now for the future, because we have welcomed Muslim immigrants. You know, I think it was estimated by somebody to me, and I would have it checked, but I think it's probably true, that when the Ismailis came as of 1970, and eventually became the number that they came, at the time, Canada probably had maybe 1,000 Muslims in it. And yet, you all came, the Jamaat, and you've made a wonderful contribution to this country. You've worked hard. You started out with very little, and I know so many of you, and I know your journey. I know where you've been and where you've gotten to, and all of this because you have had the direction of really the most extraordinary human being alive on the planet, which is His Highness. You are very fortunate people for that reason. And because of his leadership and his guidance as your Imam, you have been able to give back to this country in a way which is truly extraordinary. And you must keep doing that. It is very important for you not to be discouraged by this blind hatred and stupid prejudice. And also to help, I think we now have to really make an effort to get educational systems to put studies of Muslim cultures back into schools in somehow, that it's not some little exotic thing, because the number of Muslims that we have in Canada, and we welcome them, and they're of all different shades, just as Christians are of all different shades. I mean, those of us who are brought up in Canada know the difference between Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Presbyterians, the United Church, evangelicals. We know that. We've absorbed all of that. But you say to the average Canadian, what is an Ismaili? Or what is the difference between Shia and Sunni? And what is the significance of Baghdad? As His Highness pointed out, when Baghdad was attacked, imagine what people in the West would have thought if Rome was attacked, or if London was attacked, center of the civilization, the representation of it through the years. So we have that education, I think we have to work for in our provincial education systems. If we don't have health in our society, then it makes it possible for us to be prejudiced and to hate other people. If we don't have the feeling towards others in a deep, personal way, and that's what our religions give us, is the ability to relate to other people in a personal way, because everyone is created by God, and every human being is a human being. And as my wonderful friend Romeo Dallaire says, no human being is more human than any other. If we all believe that, and if we all work to that through our faith systems, then we would be on a road to not repeating ourselves with hatred and prejudice and bigotry. But as long as we don't do that, as long as we don't acknowledge what we have been, these things will come to haunt us. We must put pressure also on our governments. We must put pressure on our members of parliament Certainly, the ones of one's own faith, that's one thing, it doesn't really matter. But anybody who represents you in a democracy, you can say to them, you know, we don't like this. We don't like what's happening. We should be putting pressure on our provincial governments for the education of about cultures, about civilizations, so that people do understand the difference, because Muslims are very different in all their manifestations, just as the Christian world is different, and Jews are different. If we don't do that, we're really, saying we're just happy to live with things as they are. And then with all the new developments like social media and the way in which people get their information now, we will find ourselves in an increasingly difficult time. It's very, very hard to live in a period where you have to stand up for things. It's so much easier to live in a time where things are going along easily and you don't have to make hard decisions and you don't have to confront people. But it is really important that we do that. And we must never let anything go by. We must never let any slur of any other group go by.
And yeah, and I think we have to also look internally, right? Like within diverse and racialized and BIPOC communities, because that it also exists there with other communities as well. So I think there's an internal search that needs to happen as well.
Yes, and we are called to love one another as God loves us. Take that seriously. And how does God love us? God loves us because we're just who we are, with all our flaws, etc. And that kind of thing, that encompassing, is the way in which we have to accept other people, accept what their failings may be, and when things happen that aren't right, then the element of forgiveness comes in. And I think that Canada as a nation has to ask for the forgiveness of the Indigenous people. And I think if we were to think always personally about how we deal with questions like the Indigenous people and our shame and guilt, it would be very important. The other thing I think is really important for us all as newcomers to this country. I came when I was 3. I know many of my friends were born here who are Ismaili, but some of them came when they were my age or when they were 7 or whatever. And you must never, ever say, this happened in the country before I came here. It is not my responsibility. It is your responsibility. Canada adopted you, and you became a full member of this country. We've given you everything. Canada has given you everything. The opportunity to be what you are, the opportunity to do what you can do. So you are a part of the family, and that family is unfortunately not only a nice family that has a nice house and atmosphere and all that, but has a crazy alcoholic uncle that has an aunt who unfortunately had to spend some time in jail. And those are all your relatives, and you are responsible for them. We have adopted you, and now you're responsible for the family. And I often say too, that being part of Canada is not like going to a all-you-can-eat buffet and taking what you want. Like I want the roast beef and I don't want the lobster. I'd like the shrimp, etc. It's a fixed menu. The fixed menu is the soup, the main course, and the dessert. And that's what we do as Canadians. We have a fixed menu. All of history that we have lived through is your responsibility once you become Canadian. You take that as seriously as though your family came to this country the way my husband's family came to this country after the American Revolution. That is really important. None of this is all our responsibility. And if we don't take it seriously, we who are the newcomers, then it's all not going to hold together. It's dependent upon us because we learn about it. We should be horrified by it. Our children should be horrified by it. They are horrified by it. And we should say, we agree. We think it's horrifying. And it's just as horrifying as having been persecuted by Idi Amin, for instance, just to take one that's close to the Jamaat. It is just as horrible what we have done. What you have to find ways to do is to make things better. Once you acknowledge the problem, then get on with helping to heal it. There are ways that we're going to find together that we didn't imagine that we would be doing together. And I think we have to put pressure on our governments always. We have, for one thing, and I'm very glad to have this captive audience, I want you all to write to the government now and say, implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 recommendations now. You received it as a government. The Canadian government received it in 2015 with a great deal of ceremony, with all kinds of wonderful words. Then, I guess, in your own lives, you have to figure out how you can help to make things better for others. I always find that if you help to make things better for others, it makes you feel that you can have the right feelings about what you do for yourself. I don't know, there's a kind of feeling of sharing and of being equal with others that makes you feel, your common humanity. And all of you following the most wonderful edicts of the Imam know that, and then you know and you feel that. And because you go to Jamaat and you pray, and a lot of you pray on a daily basis, very directly. And I often envy Islam because it is 600 years younger than Christianity. And I have said to friends who don't know Islam very well, think of what Christianity was like in the 14th century, 13th century, when they were building those Gothic cathedrals, when they were worshiping God in a way which was concrete, when they were building, the people who built those cathedrals that you see in Europe, they knew that they would not see them finished. They knew that it would be not even their grandchildren who would see them finished, and yet they started them. They carved the stones, they put the stones up, and then they died. And you think of their life expectancy then was about 32 years old if they were very lucky. And yet they started that knowing they wouldn't see the end of it. And that's the other thing, that we should not be thinking of immediate gratification always. We want to see this, the beginning and the end of this. And it's always very hard for us because we're all, quite driven, and your community is an enormously dynamic one. I know them. And you have, you want to get projects done, and there are things that you can do and finish and see the results of. But there are others where you have to say, I'm just part of this thing that's going to go on, that has gone on before me, will go on after me, and I'm contributing to it while I'm here. And I won't see the end of it, but I will do my best to strengthen it while I can.
I'm going to take you back a little bit. In his acceptance speech of the Adrienne Clarkson Prize for Global Citizenship, His Highness spoke about media fragmentation and how many now live in media bubbles resisting diverse views. So how do you see the acceleration of technology and social media creating more bubbles, more polarization? And what do you see as the antidote to this in your mind?
The antidote to this is, of course, education, good, solid education right from the beginning, that everybody has the tools, that is, that they can read and write. It is that I think the larger question of involvement of human beings in good activities and social things will help to mitigate against the isolation that social media can bring. If people are more involved in their communities, if they are more involved with worthwhile, interesting things, that's why we have to keep our cultural institutions very vibrant and vivid. That's why we have to introduce people to things like our national parks and our museums. One of the things that the Institute for Canadian Citizenship has done is, since its very beginning and its first program, is to give to all new Canadian citizens a cultural access pass now called Canoe that allows them to now access 1,700 cultural institutions in the country, almost all, not all, and all the national parks and provincial parks, and to get 50% off on Via Rail to travel the country. That is to get a familiarity with things. And I think culture plays a big role in this. So these things mitigate some of the things of what social media, the bad that social media can do. But education, socialization, all of that, places where people can gather. I myself feel, in no other country could I have reached the equivalent of being the Governor General. There was no other country.
Jagmeet Singh, said in the House of Commons, people are saying this is not my Canada, but it is Canada, as you mentioned. It's like a dysfunctional family. This stuff happens. We have to recognize this dark part of our past. We've talked a lot about what we can do to take steps forward in terms of reconciliation. But I want to ask you again about something to do with Muslim civilizations. And if we go back to that ceremony again 5 years ago in Toronto, you asked His Highness about the ignorance in the Western world about Islam and the vacuum of knowledge about the diversity in the Muslim world and the richness of the history in the Muslim world. And His Highness had responded by questioning our education of that history and challenging us to look at great Muslim thinkers and scientists and medical figures. In fact, I don't even know how many people know that the Pfizer vaccine was developed by a Muslim couple, Ur Shaheen and Oslam Turesi. Do you think we are making progress in this area? Again, this conversation was 5 years ago.
No, and that's because people who are not Muslim or who are a part of that Western tradition believe that they are the ones who did everything, and they always want to think that when it's not true. And only education can change that, and that's why our education systems really we have to pick that up and really understand that has to be integrated into our education systems, a knowledge of the Islamic world and of its differences, because people have to know the differences in Islam, or they won't understand. They don't understand politics because of that. I mean, how can they understand Saudi Arabia without knowing about Wahhabi? How can they think about anything that is going to cause progress without seeing differences in the way in which Shia and Sunni have developed in the world? If you don't know any of those things, it is just, you're just crazy and ignorant. I don't know how many people have read the Quran out of interest, but there are things in the Quran which His Highness has pointed out to us. And one of the ones I use all the time, I'm paraphrasing it because there are different translations of it, is that God could have created us all the same, but He didn't, because we are now given the opportunity to learn about each other. The moment I learned that, I thought that is the most wonderful challenge to us, because we were not all created the same, and that we as human beings, in order to fully exert what we are as human beings and what we are before God, is to say, we know that we are different, and we will make the effort to understand those differences between them, not in order to change or to convert or to say, think the way I do, but to understand what that is, and that is an opportunity for us, that our diversity and our plurality is an opportunity for us to be greater as human beings. That is the challenge to us as truly human beings. And that's the verse of the Quran that everybody should know.
On that note, His Highness created the Global Center for Pluralism. What do you hope to see in terms of the impact that the GCP is going to have in the years ahead?
Well, I think we're making great progress in terms of getting governments on side in different countries. There are different countries that we're going to be working up, looking at how they look at the pluralism in their countries. There's also just the constant reaching out to looking at the differences that there are, and I think it's not something that can be solved, very quickly over a period of, let's say, have a 5-year plan on this. It is something that is going to be a constant, and we are working very well and refining under the leadership of Meredith Preston McGee, who is a very fine leader and Secretary General of the GCP, looking at places like Africa, looking at the roles of Indigenous people in places like India, for instance. And I think it's going to make a great deal of difference. But we're plugging along, and I think it was a wonderful, wonderful idea to set it up, and to set it up in Canada. It's a challenge to Canada now. I don't know if His Highness thought about it that way, and probably he didn't, but it is a challenge to Canada to have the Global Centre for Pluralism in Ottawa on really what is, I think, quite a meaningful and even perhaps sacred site of Indigenous people on Sussex Drive, looking out on the Ottawa River, just where the Rideau River comes into it, and the Gatineau, that confluence of the three great rivers, which meant so much to the Indigenous people that they always met there. And that's why Ottawa has a sacred basis to it. I think we're very lucky as Canadians to have that.
As you know, today's program is being watched by our Smiley community across the country, who have seen you for the better part of 2 decades, working side by side with His Highness, advancing the values embraced by Canada and the values embraced by the Imamat. So I'm curious, what have been some of your key learnings from working with His Highness, and how has that relationship impacted you?
Well, I think His Highness has made a greater impact on me than any other human being, except for my parents and my high school English teacher, who influenced where I was going to go to school and what I was going to study and that sort of thing. But in my adult life, nobody has influenced me more than he. And I have to say that he and I are about the same age. He is a year and a half older than I am, but I was in university, and my parents, I was in residence at St. Hilda's College, at Trinity College, and my parents subscribed me to Time magazine and Reader's Digest so that I would get the magazines, because we always got magazines at home. And when I went away for 4 years, they subscribed me to Time magazine. And one day I came down in my slot, I opened it, and on the cover was this photo of this young man about my age, and saying that he is the new Aga Khan, and then an article about him, and that he was at Harvard and he was in his 3rd year. I was in my 2nd year at university. And I sat down at coffee after lunchtime with a group of friends, and I showed it to them, and I said, can you imagine if we at our age were put in charge of this worldwide religion and culture? I mean, how can he possibly do that? And I didn't have any Muslim friends growing up. I didn't have any Muslim friends till I met Muslims when I went to university at the Sorbonne in Paris. But for me, His Highness has always been, I've always listened to what he said whenever I would read how he addressed the United Nations or various things. And meeting him was, I think, one of the great privileges of my being Governor General, because he came to turn the sod of the Imamat on Sussex Drive, and that was really an important moment for me. And I have been very happy that I've been able to help in the work that he sees for the Jamaat in Canada, and I will always continue to do that. It has been a personal, I can't even say enrichment. It's just made so much difference in my life to have known him.
Madame Clarkson, I cannot thank you enough for your time, your knowledge, your experience, and you sharing it so candidly with us today in the hopes of a better future. We are all richer for this conversation. Thank you.
Any time I spend with the Jamaat is time well spent for me. I wish you all the best, and I thank you, and I hope that we can work together to make Canada a better country than it seems to be at this moment.
با تشکر از شما خانم کلارکسون برای به اشتراک گذاشتن تجربه خود و ما واقعا الهام بخش بود. برای ما این گفتگو حائز اهمیت فراوان است. یک جهان تشکر. همچنین باید در طول این حوادث غم‌انگیز برای پرداز احساسات خود و بحث در مورد مسائل با فرزندانمان زمان بگذاریم برای کمک بیشتر، برای درک بیشتر این موضوع که چگونه ایمانمان در این زمان حساس به ما کمک می کند. میشنویم از الواعظه تسلیم الانی ورجی. دکتر تسلیم الانی ورجی روانشناس هستند که تمرینات شناخت رفتاری ذهن را ارائه می کنند. دکتر الانی ورجی استادان و معلمان را مشوره می دهد و تحقیقات مربوط به سلامت روحی، تندرستی، عدالت اجتماعی و شایستگی فرهنگی را انجام می دهد. الواعظه همچنین فارغ التحصیل برنامه آموزشی بین المللی واعظین است. لطفاً به دکتر الواعظه تسلیم الانی ورجی خوش آمدید بگویید.
Yali Madad. I start today's message with Yali Madad because it is one that we are familiar with. It is a term of comfort. But also, when we say Yali Madad, this means may Ali help you. And the Ali that we are referring to here is Hazrat Ali, alayhi salam, our first Imam. Hazrat Ali is known to many people, not just Shia Muslims, as a symbol of courage, of strength, and of bravery. And it is this strength, this courage, and this bravery that I hope that we can all feel every single day as we continue to have the conversation about the events that took place. In our community, we have survived so many losses. The killings that took place in London, Ontario are but one example of this. This loss is not new. The pain isn't new. And for some of us, we continue to experience this loss, this grief, whatever it is that we are feeling, over and over and over again. Anytime we listen to the news, anytime we think about what is happening in other parts of the world, we are reminded that there is so much loss and so much injustice. We might be feeling a lot of different things right now, and no matter what we are feeling, these feelings are normal and they are valid. Our emotions help us understand what is going on for us. They can help us understand how we interpret a situation. It can help us communicate how we are feeling to others. And it can also help us understand how others are feeling so that we can perhaps understand them better and support them better. I often think about an emotions wheel as a helpful way for us to understand how we're feeling, especially when we're not 100% sure. The emotions wheel shows us our basic emotions, such as anger, happiness, and sadness. And then it becomes a little bit more specific to help us understand the nuances of our emotions. If I ask myself, what am I feeling right now? I would look at my emotions wheel and I would identify sadness, anger, confusion, vulnerability. And so I invite all of you, take a few seconds. What are you feeling? Perhaps in response to what happened, perhaps just in response to what is happening around the world, all of the injustices that we continue to see. Or perhaps it's not related to any of that. But taking a few seconds to know what exactly you are feeling can help you make sense of your behaviors, of your bodily sensations, and of your thoughts. While we might not know exactly why we're feeling a certain way, we can still acknowledge the emotion, and we can allow ourselves to experience it. When we think specifically about the loss that has happened more recently, we can think about it within the frame of collective grief. This is when a lot of people come together to grieve together, not necessarily physically, but about a specific situation. Whether we knew the family or not, whether we knew the details of their deaths and the context of their deaths or not, we are grieving as a community, as a society. We can perhaps relate to one another and connect with one another through this grief. We might have different ways of making sense of it, and for some, there may be anger. For others, there may be rage. For others, there may be sadness or confusion. Some may not feel a whole lot of anything right now, and that's okay too. Know that even though we may be feeling different things, we are still allowed to come together and to have this emotional experience together. We should give ourselves the opportunity to grieve. And this can take as long as it's going to take. For some, it might be the day. For some, it might be weeks. For some, it might be months. And let us remember that this specific instance is not in isolation. And so a lot of the time, that grief comes up over and over and over again with the racial injustices that we hear, with the Islamophobia that we hear about, with the systemic discrimination that we hear about. That grief and that trauma gets re-triggered over and over again. Some of the ways that we might express that grief include perhaps crying, or maybe writing letters to our local governments. It might be going for a run, or painting, or cooking. No matter what it is, allow yourself to feel what it is that you're feeling. And know that those feelings may change over time. Sometimes it might seem easier not to think about it, to just keep our heads down, focus on our work, and get the things done that need to get done. And while it may seem easier in the moment, it often makes it more complicated to make sense of later on. We may also have children who are trying to make sense of this. And some of the things that we can remind them of is that the Quran teaches us that we were created in diversity so that we may know one another. But just because we believe that doesn't mean that everyone else does. And sometimes unfamiliarity brings about fear. Fear does not justify violence against others. However, it can help us understand why people do what they do. It can also be helpful to acknowledge with our children that Islamophobia is real. This is not to make them feel afraid of the world that we live in. But when we don't understand that Islamophobia is real, when we experience acts of violence, acts of discrimination, we may start to think that it's about us personally, that we are doing something wrong, or that there is something wrong with us. So when we can address it as something systemic, something that's outside of ourselves as individuals, that can help bring about a sense of comfort to our children and to our colleagues and to our peers, that it isn't about us. We haven't done anything wrong, and yet people don't understand. And some people are not interested in understanding. When our children ask us questions, we can also sit and really listen to them. Some of their questions may be hard, some of their questions may be painful. It's okay for you to feel that pain, and it's okay for you to not have the answer. But the more we can listen, and the more we can engage them in active dialogue, the more we promote learning, the more we promote understanding and compassion. And when we don't have the answers, perhaps together with our children we can go and seek out those answers so that we can learn together. We can also acknowledge the pain of some of the questions that are being asked and explain why we experience that pain. Talking about these things can be hard, and so practicing compassion with them and with ourselves can be so helpful as we try to navigate all of this. We can also remember that the more informed we are about our religion, our beliefs and our history, the easier it can be to have hard conversations with our children, with our families, with our colleagues, and with our peers. No matter who wants to know, the more we know, the easier it is to share those views with others. And we can emphasize the importance of living within the ethics of our faith and the importance of role modeling inclusivity and pluralism. This is the best way for our children to learn about the importance of how they should treat one another. They should learn about what our values and our ethics teach us about pluralism, about celebrating difference and understanding it. And it will teach them that these instances and incidences that we hear about in the news, they are not examples of how we should treat one another, but they are opportunities for us to learn and to clarify how it is that we want to live our lives and how we want to treat others. This has been a hard time for many of us, and so we can also turn to our faith for peace and for comfort. We may find that comfort and peace by praying for those whose lives have been lost. We may also find that comfort and that safety in praying for ourselves, for our safety, for our comfort, and for our own well-being. And perhaps we can remember that our Imam reminds us that he is always here for us. He is thinking about us, he is praying for us, and he is showering us with his love and with his blessings. We can remember that our faith teaches us that we should always try to learn. And so, we can ask ourselves, what do we want to learn from these situations, from these acts of violence? How do we want to grow from these? How do we want to find our peace? And we can let these lessons and let our ethics guide our next steps. Yali Madad.
متشکرم از شما دکتر الانی ورجی. شما به ما خیلی مسائل مهم را در این شرایط بحرانی آموختید. ما برنامه امشب را به طور معمول با یک پارچه موسیقی به پایان می رسانیم. پارچه موسیقی امشب یک پارچه تازه از آمین است، یعنی دعای جهانی از امید. این پارچه دارای 25 هنرمند اسماعیلی از سراسر جهان است. این آهنگ دعا را برای درد، کاهش ترس و امید به آینده بیان می کند. اظهار سپاس و متشکرم که این هفته با من یک جا شدید و برای کسانی از شما که امروز روزه گرفتند، امیدوارم این فرصت را داشته باشید که یک وعده غذایی فوق العاده داشته باشید. در امان بمانید، مراقب خودتان باشید، مراقب همدیگر باشید و آخر هفته فوق العاده داشته باشید. یا علی مدد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم خداوندا تو سلطان کریمی تو بسم الله الرحمن الرحیمی ببخشا بر من زار و مقصر غفورا راه ما یارم به
whose only lullaby is the sound of a mother's cry. And did you know that there are those in this world whose only hope is to close their eyes? inside to the only light they know. There are times when prayer is all we have to give, and so this day I pray that we be blessed in every single way.
يكشف السوء نادي عليا مظهرا لجوه تجده عونا لك في